In a big, busy city filled with tall buildings and noisy streets, there was a podcast that everyone talked about. It was called Truth Unfiltered. The host of the show was Greg Marshall, a man known for being very direct and often critical of religion. Greg didn't believe in God or anything spiritual, and he wasn't shy about saying so. He liked to challenge people who did believe in those things, especially if they were famous. His show had millions of listeners because people enjoyed hearing him argue with guests who thought differently than he did. Greg's episodes were always lively. Sometimes they were funny, sometimes intense, but they were never boring. One day, Greg got an idea for a new episode that excited him. He wanted to invite Keanu Reeves, the famous actor everyone loved. Keanu wasn't just admired for his movies. He was also known for being humble and kind. But what interested Greg most was something else: Keanu's faith. Rumors said Keanu believed in a higher power, even though he didn't talk about it much, publicly. When Greg reached out to Keanu's team, he was surprised when they agreed to the interview. Keanu rarely gave interviews about his personal life, let alone his beliefs, so this felt like a big deal. Greg couldn't wait to have him on the show. As soon as the announcement went live, fans started buzzing online. Everyone wondered how the conversation would go between the bold atheist host and the quiet, thoughtful actor. Greg spent days preparing for the episode. He read articles, watched old interviews, and jotted down questions designed to make Keanu think twice about his views. "This is going to be great," Greg told himself with a smirk. He imagined exposing Keanu's contradictions, that a wealthy movie star could claim to connect with some divine force while living such a privileged life. To Greg, it seemed hypocritical, and hypocrisy was something he loved pointing out. The day of the recording arrived. The studio buzzed with energy as the crew set up microphones and adjusted lights. Greg wore his usual confident smile as he took his seat behind the desk. Across from him sat Keanu, dressed casually in jeans and a plain shirt. Unlike many celebrities, Keanu didn't try to impress anyone with fancy clothes or flashy accessories. He looked calm and relaxed, almost like he was meeting an old friend instead of appearing on a controversial podcast. As the cameras rolled and the red light blinked on, signaling the start of the episode, Greg greeted Keanu warmly. "Welcome to Truth Unfiltered, Keanu. Thanks for joining us today." "Thanks for having me," Keanu replied with a small smile. His voice was soft, but there was a warmth to it that made people feel comfortable. Greg began by asking Keanu about his career, keeping the tone light at first. They chatted briefly about Keanu's latest projects and his experiences working in Hollywood. But Greg knew his audience wanted more. They wanted the real reason Keanu was there. So after a few minutes of casual conversation, Greg leaned forward, slightly, his expression shifting from friendly to curious. "So, Keanu," Greg said, tilting his head, "you've mentioned in previous interviews that you believe in something greater than yourself. Can you tell us what that means to you?" Keanu nodded slowly, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. "Sure," he said finally. "For me, believing in something greater isn't about following rules or rituals. It's about feeling connected to other people, to nature, to, well, everything." Greg raised an eyebrow, intrigued but ready to push further. "Connected? That sounds nice, but isn't it just a way to cope? You know, dealing with fame and all its pressures?" Keanu chuckled, softly, shaking his head. "Not really. Fame has its challenges, sure, but belief isn't about escaping those challenges. It's about finding meaning in them. Even when things are tough, I feel like I'm part of something bigger." Greg frowned slightly. This wasn't the answer he expected. Most people would get defensive or try to explain themselves more clearly. But Keanu stayed calm, speaking with a quiet confidence that made Greg uneasy. Still, Greg pressed on. "But come on, Keanu," Greg said, leaning back in, his chair now crossing his arms. "You're one of the most successful actors in the world. You've got money, fame, everything anyone could want. How can you say you understand struggle or connection when your life is so different from, say, someone working 2 jobs just to pay rent?" The room grew quiet as Greg's words hung in the air. For a brief moment, Keanu looked away, as if gathering strength. Then he turned back to Greg, his eyes steady. I may have success, but I've faced loss too. Loss doesn't care about money or fame. It affects everyone equally. Greg hesitated. He hadn't planned for this turn in the conversation. He thought Keanu would dodge the question or give a vague response, but instead, Keanu was opening up in a way that felt genuine. Greg decided to keep pushing, hoping to catch Keanu off guard. All right, fair enough, Greg said quickly, brushing past the awkward pause. But why hold on to faith? Why not rely on science or logic? Those things actually prove stuff, unlike religion. Keanu tilted his head, considering the question carefully. Science is amazing, he said after a moment. It helps us understand how the universe works. But faith answers a different question. It asks, why? Why are we here? Why do we care about each other? Science and faith don't have to fight. They can work together. Greg opened his mouth to respond, but stopped. Keanu's answers weren't what he'd anticipated. Instead of arguing or getting upset, Keanu remained calm and thoughtful. Each reply seemed to chip away at Greg's confidence, leaving him unsure of how to continue. The rest of the interview followed a similar pattern. Greg tried again and again to poke holes in Keanu's beliefs, but Keanu met every challenge with patience and grace. By the end of the episode, Greg felt unsettled. Something about Keanu's demeanor, the sincerity in his voice, the lack of defensiveness, stayed with Greg long after the cameras stopped rolling. Later that night, as Greg sat alone in his office, replaying the conversation in his mind, he realized something surprising. He hadn't won the debate. In fact, he wasn't even sure what winning would look like anymore. For the first time, Greg questioned whether his approach to discussing faith was fair, or if he'd been missing something important all along. The next morning, Greg woke up feeling restless. He couldn't shake the memory of the interview with Keanu Reeves. It wasn't just that Keanu had been calm and composed. It was the way he spoke with such conviction, without ever sounding arrogant. Greg had gone into the conversation expecting to dismantle Keanu's beliefs, but instead, he found himself questioning his own assumptions. As he sipped his coffee and scrolled through social media, Greg noticed the reactions pouring in from listeners. Some praised him for challenging Keanu, saying it was exactly what they expected from Truth Unfiltered. Others criticized him, accusing him of being too harsh or dismissive. But what caught Greg's attention were the comments from people who said they admired Keanu's responses. Many wrote about how Keanu's words made them reflect on their own lives and beliefs. Greg frowned at the screen. He didn't like the idea that his audience might be siding with Keanu. After all, his show was supposed to expose flaws in religious thinking, not make people reconsider their views. Still, he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, he'd missed something important during the interview. Later that day, Greg decided to revisit the recording. He told himself it was just to review his performance, but deep down he knew he wanted to understand why Keanu's answers had stayed with him. As he listened again, he paid closer attention to Keanu's tone and choice of words. There was no hint of defensiveness or anger, even when Greg's questions became pointed. Instead, Keanu responded with patience and thoughtfulness, as if he genuinely believed every word he said. One part stood out to Greg more than anything else. When Greg had accused Keanu of using faith as a crutch, Keanu had simply smiled and said, "Faith isn't about running away from pain, it's about finding strength to face it." At the time, Greg had brushed it off as a cliché, but now, hearing it again, the words carried weight. They reminded him of conversations he'd overheard growing up, though he hadn't paid much attention to them back then. Greg leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He remembered his childhood vaguely, his parents arguing late into the night, their voices echoing through the house. His mother had clung to her faith during those hard times, praying quietly in the corner while his father raged. Greg had always seen her prayers as weakness, a refusal to confront reality. But, now listening to Keanu's words, he wondered if there was more to it. Maybe faith wasn't about avoiding problems. Maybe it was about enduring them. Determined to dig deeper, Greg started researching Keanu's life. He read articles, watched interviews, and even looked up old photos. What he discovered surprised him. Keanu wasn't just an actor who occasionally mentioned spirituality in passing. He lived his beliefs in ways Greg hadn't realized. For example, Keanu often visited children's hospitals, spending hours talking to sick kids and their families. He did it quietly, without announcing it to the press or posting pictures online. Greg came across a story about a grieving mother whose young daughter had died after battling cancer. Keanu had met the family during one of his hospital visits and stayed in touch, offering support long after most celebrities would have moved on. The mother described Keanu as kind and genuine, someone who truly cared about others' pain. Reading these stories made Greg feel uneasy. He prided himself on being honest and straightforward, but compared to Keanu, his approach suddenly seemed shallow. Greg had spent years mocking faith and ridiculing believers, yet here was a man who embodied compassion and humility without preaching or seeking recognition. That night, Greg lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts about the interview, Keanu's life, and his own beliefs or lack thereof. He thought about the moments in his life when he'd felt lost or overwhelmed. During those times, he'd turned to logic and reason, telling himself that emotions were unreliable. But now he wondered if he'd been missing something by shutting out the possibility of faith entirely. The next morning, Greg arrived at the studio earlier than usual. He sat at his desk, staring at the blank computer screen. Normally, he'd already have a list of topics for the next episode, but today his mind was elsewhere. He opened a new document and typed a single sentence. What if I've been wrong? It was a question he never thought he'd ask himself. For years, Greg had built his identity around skepticism and rationality. Admitting doubt felt like betraying everything he stood for. Yet, the more he reflected on his conversation with Keanu, the harder it became to ignore the cracks forming in his worldview. Over the next few days, Greg began to notice small changes in how he interacted with others. He found himself listening more carefully during conversations, resisting the urge to interrupt or argue. When a friend mentioned attending church, Greg didn't roll his eyes or make a sarcastic comment like he usually would. Instead, he asked questions, genuinely curious about why faith mattered to them. At first, Greg worried that these changes might make him seem weak or uncertain. But to his surprise, people responded positively. Friends and colleagues commented on how much calmer and more open-minded he seemed. Even longtime listeners of his podcast noticed a shift in his tone. While Greg still challenged guests on their beliefs, he did so with less hostility and more curiosity. Despite these changes, Greg struggled with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to embrace this new perspective fully, while another part clung to his old convictions. He told himself he wasn't ready to believe in God or anything supernatural, but he couldn't deny that Keanu's example had planted a seed of doubt in his mind. One evening, as Greg walked home from the studio, he passed by a small park. A group of children played on the swings, laughing and shouting as their parents watched from nearby benches. Greg paused for a moment, watching the scene unfold. It struck him how simple and joyful it all seemed, untouched by the complexities of adult life. For a brief moment, Greg allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to believe in something greater, not because it solved problems, but because it gave meaning to them. He shook his head, dismissing the thought almost immediately. Belief wasn't something you could force, he reminded himself. But as he continued walking, he couldn't help wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than what he'd always assumed. Greg didn't have answers yet, and he wasn't sure he ever would. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps understanding wasn't about proving or disproving. It was about exploring and embracing the unknown. And as daunting as that realization was, it also felt strangely freeing. A few weeks after the interview with Keanu Reeves, Greg received an email that caught him off guard. It was from Keanu's team, inviting him to a charity event hosted by the actor. The message was polite and brief, explaining that the event aimed to raise funds for children battling serious illnesses and their families. Normally, Greg would have declined such invitations. He wasn't one for formal gatherings or public appearances beyond his podcast. But this time, something made him hesitate. Greg stared at the email for a long time, tapping his fingers on the desk. He thought about Keanu's calm demeanor during their conversation, the way he spoke about faith not as a theory, but as a lived experience. Curiosity got the better of him. Against his usual instincts, Greg replied to the email, accepting the invitation. What's the worst that could happen? He muttered to himself as he hit send. The day of the event arrived, and Greg found himself standing outside a large community center. The building was decorated with colorful banners and balloons, and cheerful music played softly in the background. Inside, tables were set up with food, games, and activities for kids. Despite the festive atmosphere, there was an undercurrent of seriousness. Many of the children wore hospital bracelets, and some were accompanied by parents who looked tired but determined to make the most of the day. Greg felt out of place. He had dressed casually, thinking it would help him blend in, but he still stood out among the crowd. Most people seemed to know each other, chatting and laughing like old friends. Greg wandered around awkwardly, unsure of what to do or where to go. He spotted Keanu almost immediately. The actor was sitting on the floor with a group of children, helping them build towers out of blocks. There were no cameras around, no entourage, just Keanu, fully present in the moment. For a while, Greg watched from a distance, observing how Keanu interacted with the kids. He didn't treat them like fragile beings defined by their illnesses. Instead, he joked with them, listened to their stories, and encouraged their imaginations. One boy, no older than 6, proudly showed Keanu a drawing he'd made of a superhero. Keanu smiled warmly and said, "Wow, that's incredible. You've got real talent." The boy beamed, clearly delighted by the praise. Greg felt a lump form in his throat. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen someone give so much attention and care to strangers without expecting anything in return. It wasn't just Keanu's actions. It was the sincerity behind them. There was no showmanship, no grand gestures, just genuine kindness. Eventually, Keanu noticed Greg standing nearby. He excused himself from the children and walked over, his expression friendly and welcoming. "Hey, Greg," he said with a smile. "Thanks for coming." Greg nodded, feeling suddenly self-conscious. "Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This is nice." Keanu chuckled softly. "It's more than nice, it's meaningful. These families face challenges every single day. Events like this remind them they're not alone." Greg looked around, taking in the scene again. Parents were sharing stories, volunteers were setting up games, and laughter filled the air. For a moment, the weight of illness and hardship seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of community and hope. Greg realized that Keanu wasn't just hosting the event. He was creating a space where people could find comfort and connection. Throughout the afternoon, Greg continued to observe. He saw Keanu spend time with grieving parents, offering quiet support without intruding. He watched as Keanu joined in silly games, letting kids win races and cheering loudly when they succeeded. At one point, Greg overheard a mother say to another guest, "He's been here before. Not for publicity, you know. Just because he cares." That comment stuck with Greg. He had always assumed celebrities used charitable work as a way to boost their image, but Keanu didn't seem interested in any of that. His presence was understated, almost invisible if you weren't paying attention. Yet everyone around him clearly appreciated what he did. As the sun began to set, Greg found himself sitting alone at a table, sipping a cup of coffee. He reflected on everything he'd witnessed that day. The laughter, the tears, the small acts of kindness, all of it felt profoundly human. For the first time in years, Greg allowed himself to consider the possibility that faith might not be about proving or disproving God's existence. Maybe it was about finding ways to connect with others and make life a little less lonely. Just then, Keanu approached the table and sat down across from Greg. "How are you holding up?" he asked casually. Greg shrugged. "I'm good. This has been eye-opening, I guess." Keanu nodded, his gaze thoughtful. Sometimes we get so caught up in our own worlds that we forget how much we need each other. Faith, for me, is about remembering that. Greg hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Finally, he said, "You've got a lot of patience. I don't think I could stay this calm if people kept questioning my beliefs." Keanu smiled slightly. Faith isn't about convincing others. It's about finding peace within yourself. Once you have that, it doesn't matter what anyone else says. Those words lingered in Greg's mind long after the event ended. On the drive home, he replayed the day's moments in his head, the smiles, the hugs, the quiet conversations. Something inside him shifted. He had gone to the event expecting to see a performance, a carefully curated display of goodwill. Instead, he had witnessed authenticity, a man living out his beliefs in ways that touched lives. Over the next few days, Greg found himself thinking differently about his own role in the world. He had always prided himself on being a truth seeker, someone who questioned everything. But now he wondered if he'd been too focused on tearing things down instead of building bridges. What if his purpose wasn't just to challenge beliefs, but to understand them? One evening, as Greg prepared for his next podcast episode, he decided to try something new. Instead of framing the discussion as a debate, he chose to focus on listening. He invited a guest who identified as spiritual, but not religious, and asked open-ended questions, encouraging her to share her perspective without interruption. To his surprise, the conversation flowed naturally, and listeners responded positively. Many commented on how refreshing it was to hear respectful dialogue instead of heated arguments. Encouraged by the feedback, Greg made a conscious effort to approach future episodes with more empathy. He still challenged ideas when necessary, but he did so with less hostility and more curiosity. Slowly, his show began to change, not dramatically, but enough for people to notice. Longtime fans appreciated the shift, saying it made the podcast feel more inclusive and engaging. Despite these changes, Greg knew he wasn't ready to embrace faith in the way Keanu did. He still had doubts, questions, and uncertainties. But, for the first time, he stopped seeing those doubts as barriers. Instead, he viewed them as opportunities to learn, to grow, and to connect with others in deeper ways. One night, as Greg sat alone in his apartment, he picked up a book he'd bought months ago but never read. It was about spirituality and its role in modern life. Flipping through the pages, he came across a quote that resonated with him. "Faith is not the absence of doubt. It is the courage to move forward despite it." Greg closed the book and smiled faintly. He didn't have all the answers, and maybe he never would. But he was beginning to realize that faith wasn't about having certainty. It was about trusting in the journey, even when the path ahead was unclear. And for the first time in a long time, that thought gave him a strange sense of peace. Months passed, and Greg's life began to change in subtle but significant ways. The charity event hosted by Keanu Reeves had left a lasting impression on him, and he found himself thinking about it often. It wasn't just the kindness Keanu showed or the connections he made with families. It was the sense of purpose behind everything. For the first time, Greg questioned whether his own work had meaning beyond entertainment or intellectual debate. Greg had always seen Truth Unfiltered as a platform for challenging ideas, especially those rooted in religion or spirituality. But after meeting Keanu and witnessing his approach to faith, Greg started to wonder if there was more he could do with his show. Could it be a space not just for arguments but for understanding? Could it help people explore their beliefs without fear of ridicule? These thoughts stayed with him as he planned new episodes. He decided to experiment with different types of guests. People whose views didn't align with his own, but who approached life with sincerity and conviction. One week, he invited a pastor who worked with homeless communities. Another week, he spoke with a scientist who believed in both evolution and a higher power. Each conversation pushed Greg to think differently, broadening his perspective in ways he hadn't anticipated. Listeners noticed the shift. Comments poured in, praising Greg for creating a more balanced and respectful dialogue. Some even thanked him for helping them see faith or skepticism in a new light. These responses encouraged Greg to keep exploring topics he once dismissed outright. He realized that asking questions didn't have to mean tearing someone down. It could also mean building bridges. Despite these changes, Greg still struggled internally. He wanted to believe in something greater, like Keanu seemed to, but doubt lingered in his mind. Late at night, when the city outside his window grew quiet, Greg would sit alone and wrestle with his thoughts. Was faith real, or was it just a comforting illusion? Did believing in something require proof, or was it enough to trust in the unknown? One evening, while scrolling through social media, Greg stumbled upon a video clip of Keanu speaking at a small gathering. In the video, Keanu talked about loss and resilience, sharing stories from his own life. He spoke about losing loved ones and how those experiences shaped his understanding of faith. Pain reminds us we're alive, Keanu said softly, and faith reminds us we're not alone. Greg paused the video, staring at the screen. Those words echoed in his mind, stirring emotions he couldn't quite name. Pain was something Greg understood all too well. Growing up, he had watched his parents' marriage fall apart, leaving scars that never fully healed. As an adult, he buried himself in work, using logic and reason as shields against vulnerability. Faith, to him, had always seemed like a weakness, a way to avoid facing harsh realities. But now, hearing Keanu speak so openly about pain and faith, Greg began to question that belief. Maybe faith wasn't about avoiding reality. Maybe it was about finding strength to face it. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers, but about trusting that some things couldn't be explained. And that was okay. The next day, Greg decided to reach out to Keanu. He sent a brief email thanking him for the invitation to the charity event and mentioning how much it had impacted him. To his surprise, Keanu replied within hours, inviting Greg to meet for coffee. Greg hesitated before accepting, unsure of what to expect. Part of him worried that Keanu might try to convince him to believe in God, but another part was curious to hear more about his perspective. They met at a quiet cafe tucked away in a corner of the city. Keanu greeted Greg warmly, his demeanor as calm and genuine as ever. They ordered coffee and settled into a cozy booth near the window. For a while, they chatted casually about the podcast and recent events. Then Greg took a deep breath and asked the question that had been weighing on his mind. "Keanu," he began, choosing his words carefully, "how do you deal with doubt? I mean, don't you ever feel like, what if none of this is real?" Keanu leaned back in his seat, considering the question thoughtfully. "Of course I have doubts," he said finally. "Everyone does, I think. But doubt isn't the opposite of faith, it's part of it. Believing doesn't mean never questioning. It means holding on even when you don't have all the answers." Greg nodded slowly, absorbing the response. "That's hard for me," he admitted. "I've spent my whole life looking for proof, for facts. Letting go of that feels scary." "It can be," Keanu agreed. "But sometimes letting go opens doors you didn't know were there. You don't have to figure everything out right away, just take one step at a time." Their conversation continued for over an hour, touching on topics ranging from science to philosophy to personal struggles. By the end of it, Greg felt lighter, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had begun to lift. Keanu's words weren't magical. They didn't erase Greg's doubts or instantly convert him to belief, but they gave him permission to explore without judgment. Over the following weeks, Greg continued to reflect on his journey. He started reading books on spirituality and philosophy, something he'd avoided for years. At first, he approached them critically, searching for flaws in their arguments. But gradually, he began to see value in the ideas they presented, not as absolute truths, but as possibilities worth considering. One book in particular stood out to him. It explored the intersection of science and faith, arguing that the two weren't mutually exclusive. The author suggested that science answered questions about how the universe worked, while faith addressed questions about why. This idea resonated deeply with Greg. He had always valued logic and evidence, but he now understood that not everything in life could be measured or proven. Some things simply required trust. Inspired by what he was learning, Greg decided to dedicate an entire episode of his podcast to exploring the relationship between science and faith. He invited two guests, a biologist who identified as spiritual and a theologian with a background in physics. Together, they discussed how their fields overlapped and complemented each other. Listeners were captivated by the conversation, many commenting that it was one of the most thought-provoking episodes they'd heard. As the months went by, Greg's transformation became more evident, not just in his podcast but in his daily life. He found himself seeking moments of stillness, setting aside time to reflect on his thoughts and feelings. Sometimes he visited the park where he'd walked after the interview with Keanu, watching children play and marveling at the simplicity of joy. Other times he attended community events, volunteering his time to support causes he cared about. Through it all, Greg remained honest about his doubts. He didn't pretend to have found all the answers or to suddenly embrace faith wholeheartedly. But he no longer saw doubt as a barrier. Instead, he viewed it as part of the process, a sign that he was willing to ask questions, even if the answers weren't clear. One evening, as Greg prepared for bed, he glanced at the stack of books on his nightstand. Among them was the one Keanu had recommended during their coffee meeting. Smiling faintly, Greg picked it up and flipped to a marked page. A highlighted sentence caught his eye. "Faith is not about certainty. It's about hope." He closed the book and turned off the light, lying in silence as the words sank in. Hope. That was something Greg could hold on to, even amidst uncertainty. And for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace with not knowing. A year had passed since Greg's interview with Keanu Reeves, and the changes in his life were undeniable. What started as a restless curiosity about faith had grown into a deeper exploration of meaning and purpose. Greg no longer saw himself as just an atheist or skeptic. He was someone trying to understand the world and himself on a more profound level. His podcast, Truth Unfiltered, had evolved significantly. Gone were the days of aggressive debates designed to tear down opposing views. Instead, Greg focused on creating conversations that encouraged reflection and growth. He invited guests from all walks of life: scientists, philosophers, spiritual leaders, artists, and everyday people who lived their beliefs in unique ways. Each episode became a mosaic of perspectives, showing listeners that truth wasn't always black and white, but often shades of gray. The response from his audience was overwhelmingly positive. Many fans said they appreciated the shift because it allowed them to think critically without feeling attacked. Others admitted they had never considered certain viewpoints until hearing them discussed respectfully on Greg's show. Some even reached out personally, sharing how the podcast had inspired them to explore their own beliefs or reconnect with values they had abandoned long ago. Despite this progress, Greg still wrestled with questions about faith. He hadn't embraced religion or declared a belief in God, but he had come to recognize that faith wasn't limited to organized religion. It could mean trusting in love, kindness, or hope, even when circumstances felt bleak. For Greg, faith was becoming less about proving something existed and more about finding strength to move forward despite uncertainty. One day, while scrolling through emails from listeners, Greg came across one that stood out. It was from a young woman named Emily who described herself as agnostic. She wrote about struggling with anxiety and depression, feeling disconnected from the world around her. One night, unable to sleep, she stumbled upon an episode of Greg's podcast where he interviewed a grief counselor who believed in both science and spirituality. The conversation resonated deeply with her, offering comfort during a dark time. "I wanted to thank you for creating a space where people like me can feel seen," Emily wrote. "I don't know if I'll ever fully believe in God, but your show has helped me believe in humanity again." Reading those words brought tears to Greg's eyes. He realized then that his work wasn't just about challenging ideas, it was about connecting people. By fostering dialogue instead of division, he was helping others navigate their own journeys of doubt and discovery. That realization filled him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. Encouraged by Emily's message, Greg decided to take his exploration further. He began attending local events hosted by interfaith groups, curious to learn how different communities approached spirituality. At first, he felt out of place, unsure of what to say or how to act. But as he listened to stories shared by participants, he discovered common threads running through their experiences: resilience, compassion, and a desire to make sense of suffering. During one gathering, Greg met an elderly man named Harold, who ran a small church in the suburbs. Over coffee after the event, Harold spoke openly about his struggles with faith. "There were times I doubted everything," Harold admitted. "But I kept coming back to one thing. Faith isn't about having answers. It's about asking questions and trusting that you'll find your way eventually." Greg nodded, struck by how similar Harold's words were to Keanu's. Different lives, different paths, yet the same message. Faith wasn't about certainty. It was about perseverance. That idea stayed with Greg long after their conversation ended. As weeks turned into months, Greg continued to immerse himself in these discussions, learning from everyone he met. He also started volunteering at a community center, mentoring teenagers who faced challenges ranging from bullying to poverty. Working with them reminded Greg of the charity event hosted by Keanu, the power of simple acts of kindness to create ripples of change. One evening, while helping a group of teens prepare for a talent showcase, Greg found himself reflecting on his childhood. He thought about the loneliness he had felt growing up, the anger he carried toward his parents' broken marriage. Those emotions had shaped him, leading him to build walls around his heart. Yet here he was now, surrounded by young people eager to share their talents and dreams. Watching them laugh and support each other, Greg realized how far he had come, not just professionally but personally. That night, as Greg drove home, he thought about Keanu once again. Their brief interactions had planted seeds of change in his life, seeds that continued to grow with each passing day. Inspired by this realization, Greg decided to write Keanu a letter, a gesture he hadn't planned but felt compelled to do. "Dear Keanu," he began, sitting at his desk with pen in hand, "I wanted to thank you for something bigger than I understood at the time. When we first met, I thought our conversation would be another chance to challenge someone's beliefs. Instead, it became a turning point in my life." Greg went on to describe the journey he had embarked upon since their meeting, the books he'd read, the people he'd met, the lessons he'd learned. He acknowledged that he still didn't have all the answers, but he expressed gratitude for the courage Keanu's example had given him to seek them anyway. "I don't know if I'll ever call myself a believer," Greg wrote near the end of the letter. "But I know that faith means something different to me now. It's not about avoiding pain or pretending everything makes sense. It's about holding on to hope even when things don't. And for that, I owe you more than words can say." After sealing the envelope, Greg mailed the letter, feeling lighter somehow, as if letting go of unspoken gratitude had freed him further. Days later, he received a reply from Keanu. The note was short but heartfelt. "Dear Greg, thank you for your kind words. I'm glad our conversation sparked something meaningful for you. Remember, the journey is what matters most, not the destination. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and above all, keep being open. Best wishes, Keanu." Holding the letter in his hands, Greg smiled. It wasn't advice or validation he sought, it was simply connection. Keanu's response affirmed what Greg had begun to understand. Life wasn't about arriving at definitive answers, but about embracing the process of seeking them. In the months that followed, Greg continued to evolve. His podcast gained new depth, drawing in larger audiences eager to engage in thoughtful discussions. He remained honest about his doubts, never pretending to have resolved every question. But he also celebrated the moments of clarity he found along the way, moments that reminded him of the beauty in uncertainty. One evening, as Greg sat on his balcony watching the sunset, he reflected on how much his perspective had changed. Once he had viewed faith as weakness or escapism. Now he saw it as strength, a willingness to face the unknown with courage and grace. Though he still identified as skeptical, he no longer feared the possibility of belief. Instead, he welcomed it as a companion on his journey, guiding him step by step toward understanding. As the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Greg whispered softly to himself, "Maybe faith isn't about knowing everything. Maybe it's about trusting that everything will be okay." With that thought, he leaned back in his chair, content in the moment. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in his life, Greg felt ready to walk it, not alone, but alongside the countless others searching for meaning in their own ways. Greg's journey reached a new chapter when he received an invitation to speak at a conference about modern spirituality. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking had never been his strong suit. He preferred the intimacy of one-on-one conversations, or the controlled environment of his podcast. But something about this opportunity felt right. It was a chance to share what he had learned over the past year. That doubt and faith weren't opposites, but companions on the same path. The conference took place in a quiet seaside town, far from the noise of the city. As Greg arrived, he noticed how calm everything felt. The sound of waves crashing against the shore, the salty breeze brushing against his face, and the peaceful faces of attendees gathering in small groups. For the first time in years, Greg wasn't there to challenge anyone's beliefs. He was there to listen and to share his story. When it was his turn to speak, Greg stood behind the podium, gripping the edges tightly. His heart raced as he looked out at the crowd. There were people of all ages, backgrounds, and beliefs, some dressed in traditional religious attire, others in casual clothes. Despite their differences, they shared a common curiosity, a desire to explore life's big questions together. "Hi, everyone," Greg began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "I'm not here to tell you what to believe or even if you should believe anything at all. I'm just here to share my story because maybe it will resonate with some of you." He started by talking about his early days hosting Truth Unfiltered, describing how he used to see faith as something to be dismantled rather than understood. He admitted that his goal had been to expose contradictions, to prove that logic and reason were superior to belief. "But then," he said, pausing for effect, "I met someone who changed everything." Greg went on to recount his interview with Keanu Reeves, the calmness in Keanu's responses, the sincerity in his words, and the way he spoke about faith not as an escape, but as a source of strength. He described the charity event, the conversations he'd had afterward, and the slow shift in his perspective. By the time he mentioned the letter he wrote to Keanu and the reply he received, the room was silent, hanging on to every word. "I realized something important during this journey," Greg continued. "Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting yourself, and sometimes trusting others enough to keep asking questions. It's about finding meaning in moments of connection, whether those moments happen in a hospital room, a park, or even a podcast studio." As Greg spoke, he noticed nods of agreement throughout the audience. Some people scribbled notes while others simply listened, their eyes fixed on him. When he finished, the room erupted into applause. Several attendees approached him afterward, thanking him for sharing his story and expressing how much it resonated with them. One woman, a middle-aged teacher named Sarah, told Greg that she had struggled with her own doubts after losing her husband to cancer. "Your words reminded me that it's okay to question," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's okay to feel lost sometimes. Faith doesn't mean ignoring pain, it means finding hope even when things hurt." Greg nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. He hadn't expected such heartfelt reactions, and they reinforced what he had come to believe. Vulnerability had power. By opening up about his struggles, he had created space for others to do the same. In the weeks following the conference, Greg decided to take another step forward. He launched a special series on his podcast called Journeys of Belief. Each episode featured someone who had experienced a significant shift in their worldview, whether moving toward faith, away from it, or somewhere in between. The series became wildly popular, drawing listeners from all corners of the globe. Through these stories, Greg discovered that transformation wasn't unique to him. Everyone carried doubts, fears, and unanswered questions. What set people apart was how they chose to respond to them. Some clung to certainty, while others embraced uncertainty as part of the human experience. Hearing these diverse perspectives deepened Greg's understanding of faith, not as a singular destination, but as a spectrum of possibilities. One day, while recording an episode with a guest named Michael, a former pastor turned atheist, Greg asked a question that had been lingering in his mind for months. Do you think it's possible to respect someone's beliefs without agreeing with them? Michael thought for a moment before responding. Absolutely. Respect isn't about agreeing. It's about acknowledging that everyone is on their own journey. We don't have to see eye to eye to treat each other with kindness. That answer stayed with Greg long after the episode ended. It reminded him of why he had started this journey in the first place, to bridge divides, not widen them. Over time, he realized that his role wasn't to convince anyone of anything. It was to create a safe space where people could explore their thoughts and feelings without judgment. As the years passed, Greg continued to grow both personally and professionally. His podcast remained a platform for meaningful dialogue, inspiring countless listeners to reflect on their own lives. He also began writing a book, chronicling his experiences and insights. Though he still identified as skeptical, he no longer feared the unknown. Instead, he saw it as an invitation, an opportunity to learn, to connect, and to find beauty in the mysteries of existence. On a sunny afternoon, Greg returned to the park where he had walked so many times before. Children laughed as they chased each other around. Parents chatted on benches and couples strolled hand in hand. Sitting under a tree, Greg opened a journal and began writing. Faith isn't about proving or disproving, it's about trusting in the connections we make, with ourselves, with others, and with the world around us. It's about finding hope in the midst of chaos and meaning in the face of uncertainty. And most importantly, it's about embracing the journey, wherever it may lead. Closing the journal, Greg leaned back against the tree, letting the warmth of the sun wash over him. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to face it, not with fear or arrogance, but with humility and openness. Far away, in a bustling city, Keanu Reeves sat in his favorite cafe, sipping coffee, and reading a letter from Greg. A smile spread across his face as he reached the final lines. Thank you for showing me that faith isn't weakness, it's strength. Without you, I might never have taken this journey. Keanu folded the letter carefully and placed it in his pocket. Looking out the window at the busy streets below, he thought about the ripple effects of kindness, the way a single conversation could inspire change not just in one person, but in countless others. And somewhere between Greg's gratitude and Keanu's quiet reflection, the truth unfolded. Life wasn't about arriving at perfect answers, but about embracing the process of seeking them. Together, through connection and compassion, people could navigate the complexities of belief and doubt, finding solace in the shared human experience.